Hello everyone, and thank you for sticking around. It's a long, hot, sweltering day. My name's Sam. I'm the Head of Open Research and Open Scholarship in the library, and I'm going to talk very, very briefly about the kind of support that the library offers in the open research space. I'm using open research as opposed to open science as the more inclusive term because we are discipline agnostic, but I appreciate there will be a focus in the room. I'll briefly cover the training we offer, the systems that we support and administer, and the general support that we give. What I wanted to start with, though, was a promotional item, a launch for the university's Open Research Bulletin, which is a new publication launched on our Open Press at the University of Sussex, or Opus. And the reason I wanted to start with this is because, A, there's been input from people in the room, but also it's representative of how we want to kind of approach the open research space through the library division. It's been very collaborative. Kind of co-development of both the issue itself, the contents and the way that it came about. It came from the university's open research group. It's academic-led, and we provided support on the technical aspects. It includes things like practical tips, context for the various different conversations around the open research. It looks beyond the institution, but it's certainly focused at Sussex. There is a QR code. You can scan it now. All the slides will be shared afterwards. Issue 1 is very much introductory. So we cover open methods, open data and open access publishing. And some of the questions that have come up around how do you know where to publish, why would I publish open access in certain ways? I'll go into detail in that. Open data is obviously a question that applies to most of the talks we've seen so far. And that will be the subject for issue 2, which is forthcoming in a couple of months. And again, there'll be a call for papers that goes out very, very soon. So do keep an eye on that. But it's very much been a collaborative approach with Karen Patson in BSMS and colleagues in the room. For the training that we offer now, we've kind of coordinated it in a similar spirit of kind of collaboration and co-development. We have a Becoming an Open Researcher, and that's kind of the name of that program signifies that essentially it's an ongoing journey that open changes. We have to change with it. It's actually circumstances change. Everyone's very much aware of that today. It covers the basics from what to do with your data, how to plan for your data, how to manage it before you've even begun the project. We cover registered reports, pre-registration. A lot of it is signposting to external resources that are available because obviously open is global by definition. And although we have practice that we do here, we want to point to best practice elsewhere. And we link up to external training, so UKRN do Train the Trainer, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. We use that resource, we contribute back to that resource. And we're also developing training with partners at our Eastern Art Consortia universities, so that's Kent and Greenwich, Essex and UEA. The aim is to kind of distill and clarify a lot of the conversations that we've heard this morning. But again, we have gaps. We have to admit our limitations. There are technical skills that I've heard described this morning that we didn't have a clue on how to advise. So again, the co-development is really about learning from you, and that's why me and various members of my team are here today. The systems that we administer, some of you might groan when you see the names, but they are technically important towards what we're doing in the institution. Elements is the research information system that showcases you, researchers and PGRs. You can use that to kind of narrativize your open research practice in any ways you see fit. You can link that to transformational themes or other kind of labeled taxonomies, etc. And the best way to describe what you do as a researcher for the university is on the university's profile. Figshare is a repository system that sits beneath Elements. There's both publications and data repository. How you curate your data sets, what you do with them, the messy data sets that we heard about earlier on. Our research data management specialists can help you there. We also signpost to external resources and support the use of things like OSF. I've heard that a bunch of times this morning, and it's a wonderful resource that people use. Pressbooks and OJS are the systems that we use for our press. Opus. We publish not only the Open Research Bulletin, but other journals as well. We've got undergraduate journals. If you're looking to move away from the commercial academic publishers that I've heard decried so much already and want to start your own publishing habits, then do come and talk to us. We publish books, textbooks, journals and toolkits and more. Sorry, that's the QR code for the press, but again, I'll share these slides after. More generally, the support that we offer now is pivoted away. Historically, it's been open access that has predominated in conversations around open. And the library has a long history of dealing with commercial publishers trying to make work open and all the attendant problems that have already been discussed today. But we're moving more towards like open methods, how we can support you throughout the research process. We are, after all, a research support service in the library, and we want to be able to do that as best we can. And so really, the way that we've approached it is to try and gather expertise from people like yourselves in the room. We had an open research forum. It was a Teams channel. We had a couple of one-off events that were incredibly well attended, brilliant lightning talks. But then due to resource, time, the same pressures that obtain almost everywhere, it fizzled out. We tried to revamp it with an open scholarship community, again broadening that terminology to try and include people from humanities and social sciences. It was based on an international network of open science communities. Again, the same thing happened. We had a few key players and champions who really wanted to push things forward and make this business as usual at the institution. But then VL 2024 hit, and then people left for different reasons, so the same again. What's been persistent is the Open Research Group, which is a university group which has academics from various different faculties and departments on it. It's academic-led, it's chaired by members of the library, but again, we see that as a space where we can gather and kind of cohere lots of these efforts that we've heard described today. Underpinning all of that, quietly, is an open research policy that was only ratified and passed by Senate a couple of months ago, and distills the best parts of other policies that have already been at play. What to do with your data, data management plans, how to create your profile, ORCID, persistent identifiers, and open publishing as its own kind of huge behemoth thing that we have to deal with. It distills key tenets of things like ref and funder policies as well. So we tried to make it as simplified as possible, but that it do the things that the institution needs people to do. We also have our publications and copyright policy, which probably won't mean anything to you, but it means that we've been making versions of your work openly available since 2023. When you deposit the accepted version of a paper, goes into our repository, it's made open, regardless of where you publish. So there are lots of questions around where people should publish, how much that might cost. This is a way of sort of circumventing those problems and making a version of your work openly available, similar to pre-printing, but at a later stage in that chronology. Any questions you have around open access publishing, please do come and talk to my team as well. And of course, openness is the sixth value. I know the values are under intense scrutiny today of all days, but openness is one that we believe has been persistent at the institution for a very long time. We want to support it in all its forms. We want to be kind of, like I said, discipline agnostic and work out how it might be done in disciplines that don't have much experience with this. And so that's where our team is focused. So it's a very quick précis of what we offer from my team. Please do get in touch or come talk to us after, and I will hand over to Vicky now and happy to take questions after. Thank
you. This way? Yeah. Okay, so hi, I'm Vicky McDonald, so I'm the Senior Administrator for Technical Services, and I'm just going to talk to you a bit about authors. So some of you might have heard of it, some of you might not. Basically, it's a space in the library. It was started by some previous technicians and some research groups that were working together to bring together different groups of people, have different pieces of equipment, learn how to use them, do training development, have that kind of open community across that. But then again, as people have left, it didn't have anyone to take it on. So I sit within technical services and support all the technicians in all the, from ACCA to the different life sciences, the SMS, all around. So I've kind of taken it on as a kind of lead for technical services to then work with all the different departments to see what we can do with it and how we can really make use of the space and the resources available. This way. So we have three main objectives of the space. So create a sustainable model, so we don't have that one point of failure. We want to be able to create a sustainable platform where different people with different skills can take ownership of different areas and really work together across the campus to ensure the long-termness of the programme. Then we've got foster interdisciplinary collaborations. So the hub is like a nexus for cross-working across campus, across different departments, students, staff. It's a space quite centrally that people can come and use or learn things or just find out contacts and have an opportunity to grow networks. And it's an area to encourage different projects and different events that really integrate across the wider campus. Then supporting open learning and technician development. So a part of my role, supporting the technicians, there's something called the Technician Commitment, which is a now international initiative that aims to basically improve the lives of technicians in different areas. We have an action plan and we do different activities around that. So where this space has come into it is a lot of our technicians are very, very skilled in, you know, whether it's a piece of equipment, a different way of doing things. So it's giving them the opportunities to be able to teach like workshops in it and develop their skills, as well as learning and taking on different, not more work, but different opportunities to develop and be a part of different projects. So these are very big objectives, and the key thing is engagement and support from different areas. We also had to put on here, because there is no money, we know, but we have a little pot that we can hopefully invest in, whether it's equipment to do different sessions, you know, upgrading pieces of equipment, something like that. But we need the input from different people. What do people want? What's already happening? And things like that. So, for the objectives, I've just popped in a what does this mean? Because it's big objectives, and I struggled for a while to kind of get my head around authors, because we want to utilise the space and the equipment that we have, but how does it fit in? It's not just a room, you know, it's building a sustainable programme that can support. Okay, awesome. So basically we're collaborating across technical services, the library, all these different areas, and all the areas already deliver like awesome training, development within their silos. So it's bringing it together. What expertise do we have? If we want to learn 3D printing, we don't need to get an external person in, because we have experts here. So it's creating that kind of open platform to find out what people want, what skills people have, and then the logistics of bringing it all together. So far, we've had a couple of 3D printer drop-in sessions. So just from not that long since I took this on, there's so many 3D printers on campus, like hidden in people's offices. A lot of them don't work because something goes wrong. It either costs so much to send them away to get them fixed, or people don't have the time or expertise to fix that. So we have technicians who are excellent in this. So they've been training up, well, the aim is to train essentially like a little hit squad of techs or interested people that can then teach people how to do like the basic maintenance, or, you know, give guidance. So by having it set up in Authors, we're going to have a monthly drop-in where people can either book in or arrange to bring their printers. We've got all the equipment needed to take it apart or find out what's wrong with it, and a team that is skilled to do that or teach. So that's kind of the start, building into kind of a fixing it, sustainable platform. And then there's other opportunities, you know, learning soldering, learning AI, you know, different elements of it to really teach. And then my final slide is, this is me as a cat. I am not an expert in any of this. I arrange events, I talk to people. I am the conduit, and I need the experts to basically come to me or tell me what areas could you deliver a workshop on, or what would you particularly like? Is there a different ventilation thing you need for all the technical stuff? I don't have, so I need people to work with me really, spread the word and help us get it going. So if you scan this, again the slides are going to be shared, there's just a quick form, so if you register your interest or whether you want more information about it, information about sessions, or to come along or tell me, there's space on there to tell me what kind of interests you, and then hopefully we can develop it and build it together. So, thank you.
Questions?
Well, I'm wondering, for authors, you say you do open training.
Yeah.
Is that specifically in open hardware, how to build things?
Not necessarily.
Any open practice?
Yeah, it's about sharing and learning and developing and increasing people's knowledge and skills. So, from what I'm gathering anyway, because I'm new to this open stuff, but it is so wide, and it's about collaboration and things like that. So I don't think it's pigeonholed into a certain thing. Maggie?
Sorry. When I went to an opportunity for students to get involved in the technology stuff as well, then I've had questions when I've been in the library from people who just curious or kind of want to do that. So is it an offer that extends to undergraduate students as well?
Yeah, it absolutely will. We need more structure and things in place first in order to get it more robust, but absolutely. And even just having, so like there's a couple of really good there, things like that. Having the knowledge that it's there and the opportunity to teach students as well. Or they might be experts themselves, but they might want to come and, yeah.
Hello everyone, it's good to be here today. I am going to be talking about, well, I'll set the scene. I was at a music festival about just under 5 years ago now, where I met this statistician, and he's a really lovely guy, but he kept on going on and on and on about this thing called Stan, and, you know, I got to be honest with you, it was so annoying. Like, this guy was just, that was all he was talking about, and I was like, yeah. Now, I had vaguely had some contact with Stan before, because I'm sure some of you as well have also had contact with it. It's kind of accessed through the BRMS package in R, and there's also other different ways of getting at it. It's a way to kind of fit statistical models. But this guy was going on and on about this for hours, and I was like, yeah, sure. But I am standing here in front of you today because doing what he did to me then, right? Because it genuinely is really, really, really amazing. And if you're not already using it, I suggest that you kind of at least think about doing it. And it is, how does it relate to open research? Well, the models that you generate are inherently open through Stan. If you write them in this Stan programming language, you can distribute that and the model itself, and that it doesn't depend on anything external. It's anybody who has a computer, something similar to your own computer, can basically run and estimate that model without any external dependencies, literally anything. They need data, but that's all that they need. So it's a very open and reproducible way to do statistical analyses. And importantly, it kind of addresses some of the problems that with other common statistical analyses. So let's fast forward several years to a project that my PhD student Sophie was working on and has been setting up and running for quite a while. Basically, I want to show you a behavioural task that Sophie and I have been had been developing. It's all done now, basically, which generated a very particular type of data. So I've got an example of the data or the task itself and the data that it generates. So if I start up the task, you'll see that there's this array of images at the top here, and basically this is a question, and people have to select one of these possible answers below this question. So you get multiple opportunities to do this, right? So this one I am selecting, I got it wrong because it's surrounded by a red border. That one was also wrong. And I got it right. So it was surrounded by this green border. And basically you keep doing this. So all of these trials, you get multiple opportunities to do to kind of make these choices. Ignore the blue borders for now. Basically, I'm kind of repeated guessing until I get it correct. I've got 5 incorrect responses there. So that's the data that it generates, okay? And I needed, if I go back to the slides, I needed there we go. I needed to this is the data that generates. So here you might have basically time or trial is along the bottom, along the x-axis here, and the number of errors until a correct response is along the y-axis. So you can see for this participant, early on training, they're getting quite a high number of errors at first, and then gradually, the number of errors decreases towards the end of the training. They're getting 0 errors before submitting the correct response. So we had to think of a way in which to analyze these data. They're not necessarily this is kind of repeat sequential guessing aspect of it, right? So it's kind of a bit unusual, and we had to think, how do you do this? Well, it's complicated. It's a complicated data set. One thing that you might think to do, and indeed I thought to do initially, was, well, ignore the fact that people are repeatedly guessing. What we want to do is classify each trial as, did they get it right first time, or did they not get it right on the first attempt? We use that as a measure of kind of performance. And then if you think about it in that binary way, a very kind of common thing that you can do is to do a logistic regression. So a logistic regression, you have a bunch here, a red box means that they didn't get it correct on the first attempt, and a blue box is that they did get it correct on the first attempt. And as you can, logistic regression, it fits this curve, you might have seen these before, that is predicting the probability of a correct response on the first attempt as a function of this time, basically, trial number. And this sounds good, right? But there's immediately something that's a problem with this. The problem is that the model, so chance level, if with these 6 different response possibilities, the chance level should be 0.5. Sorry, 0.5. It should be 1/6. Okay. And I've put that on this graph with this dotted line over here. 1/6 is that chance level. And as you can see, the model is confidently predicting the participant's performance is below that chance level early on in training. Why does this happen? Well, it's kind of obvious when you think about it. The linear predictor, which is this time, it continually increases throughout training. But what's happening is that the participant isn't really learning at the beginning. There's this bit of a lag time for them to learn anything. And then at some point, then they start learning, okay? And a normal regression, an off-the-shelf regression analysis, can't handle that at all. So you get this kind of these poorly fitting data. So not only have we had to simplify the data that we've collected drastically, we've thrown away a load of information. Not only have we done that, if you pull one of these off-the-shelf models, you're kind of doing something that you know is not quite right. And this was a problem for us, especially because in this particular analysis, we really cared about when people started learning. Okay? And a model like this can't tell you that. So what do you do? Well, we knew that something like this might be the answer. So this is called the soft plus function, right? And what the soft plus does is it basically makes all negative numbers around 0, and anything positive, it just echoes that out. So it's kind of like this kind of shape. And I thought, what you could do is construct a model that places the learning onset at 0. That's one parameter, having a learning onset parameter, which is the trial number at this 0 point. And then what you can do is you can have a learning rate which angles this line either steeper, which would be faster learning, or shallower, which would be slower learning. And then you could do some massaging of that function, and then you get that learning curve that we really want. That was the idea. So I tried doing this to the data that we had, and it never really worked. Like, there was always a problem. I was never getting a good answer. I was like, okay, what do I do? And at some point I watched this video. It wasn't this exact video. I've actually forgotten which video it was. And it was a talk by Andrew Gelman, who is a statistician over in Columbia University. And he threw out this comment that has always stuck with me. Because at the first I heard it, I was like, that's just a clever thing to say that is actually not real. but the point behind it is so deadly spot on and serious, it is unbelievable how good this comment is. He said, I'm paraphrasing here because, as I say, I've kind of forgotten the quote verbatim. A Bayesian is not someone who uses Bayesian inference when it is reasonable. A Bayesian uses Bayesian inference even when it is not reasonable. Right? Again, like you can see how that's kind of like a maybe sarcastic or tongue-in-cheek quote, but actually what he's saying is really important here, right? That we all agree if you have a hypothesis where you're talking about your own beliefs, then it's reasonable to use Bayesian inference. But what he means by using it when it's not reasonable, you can use Bayesian inference to do this thing called regularization, to essentially put extra information into a model to kind of give you a result that you know is more consistent with reality, even if the data that model is being fit to doesn't contain enough information to get you there. So essentially, Bayesian inference can be a way of adding your own subjectivity into a model, not in a damaging way, in a way that biases your results, but in a helpful way that helps you get a result when you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get one. And yes, basically the upshot of this talk and kind of what was being said was that you should use this software package called Stan, which implements this special kind of Bayesian inference where you can kind of fit difficult to fit models. This nonlinear model that uses the soft plus function that I mentioned can be fit in Stan, adding your own information, your own subjectivity in a helpful way. So Stan is really, what is it? It's a programming language, essentially, that you write the little bits of code, and then you can compile that with this open source compiler to a standalone executable program. And that program can be used to analyze your specific data by anybody, anywhere. All they need is that program and the data, and a similar architecture of computer, that's all. So it's kind of very, very general and open. This is a typical program. The actual model that Sophie and I have been using in this project is a little bit more complicated than the one that I'm going to present here, but this is a simplified version. I'm not going to go through, it's also very small, I'm not going to go through this, but the basic idea of how it works, there are these different blocks in a Stan program, and one of the blocks, basically, you have to give it, sticking with the example of the model of the learning curve that I mentioned, you might give it, what trial number is it? Like, literally, what is the time? You might give it as well, so you give it the time, you give it the learning rate, you give it the learning onset, so those are the two parameters, and then what it will do is it will output a prediction. This particular function, it will output a prediction of how many errors should there be before somebody submits a correct response. So basically, it's predicting that performance. Now, I've not had to simplify the model in any particular way there. I'm not using an off-the-shelf model where it's rigidly stuck to binary correct or incorrect, or some number of possible correct or incorrect responses which are deemed to be independent of each other. Right? I can actually code into this particular function what my experiment looked like and kind of bespokely tailor it to that particular kind of structure of data. And then, that's all you need. You basically need to have this generative model where you put in the parameters of your model, you put in the predictors, and it will output this probability distribution. You don't need to do anything other than that. Once you've got that, you hand it over to Stan, which is what's going on in this little section. They're just formalities. You set some useful priors, which tell Stan what is a reasonable learning rate, for instance. Okay, I am not interested in considering learning rates, and by reasonable I mean I'm not interested in considering learning rates of 1 billion sort of thing. That automatically, or I'm not interested in learning rates that are like kind of too negative. I want them to be around this region, and that's just a reasonable assumption that if you didn't put that assumption explicitly into the model would just not fit. It just wouldn't be possible to estimate anything from it. So that's the sort of kind of priors that we're talking about here, weakly informative priors. And what Stan will do for you is it will output a bunch of points like this. So in that learning model that I mentioned, we've got two parameters. We've got when does learning occur, like literally what trial number does learning occur. So if you can kind of go back to this thing, you know, from this particular plot, you might think that it kind of occurs around, I don't know, if eyeballing it, I would say around 100, something like that. And actually, Stan says that the average, this is a posterior distribution of that parameter, of that learning onset parameter. And Stan says it's probably about 75-ish is the mean. And what's nice about this is it gives you some confidence. You can say, I can be, 95% sure that I am between, a learning onset of, 60 and 80 or something like that. Similarly, this parameter is the learning rate. How steep is that learning curve? And, I can see that it's well above 0, for instance, so I can tell for sure, I can be confident, given my assumptions, that this participant actually learned. That's what Stan gives you. There's some diagnostics that Stan recommends you run, so you have to do this sampling procedure many times to make sure you get consistent results. It's all mentioned on the Stan website, and there's help and guidance to do it. But actually, once you've got to this stage, it's fairly easy to kind of make inferences and kind of test models and theories and stuff like this. And this is just kind of basically the results. So these are the learning curves that we got at the end of it, and this is what they look like. I have to stress that, to my knowledge, there's not a method or a strategy or a procedure that could have another estimate model kind of fitting procedure that would have allowed us to get these kinds of results where we could reasonably test the theories that we were interested in testing. It would have just not been possible without something like Stan, at least, and I've not come across anything. So it can be a little bit intimidating to get into because you have to write this obscure language, although I think it's very aesthetically pleasing, this programming language. There is lots of helpful documentation. You do need to think a little bit about things like mathematical functions and have a good grounding in some statistical concepts. But the point of me standing here today, the take-home message really is, please don't be afraid. Try it, because it is genuinely very, very rewarding and incredibly useful. I think that's it. I'll take questions. Right. I will leave it there.
Maybe just a quick comment if somebody to say that as a principle. Like, I fully agree, actually, building models directly in Stan is really incredibly powerful once you get around it, even in the idea. And especially we can run code in Stan, and we can then run it through BRMS, and then you basically get, it works like a regular R model, and you can then use all of the easy stuff to process features, for instance, so there is really a kind of integration.
So even what you're saying is even custom written models in Stan you can analyze the output in these cells. That's quite
Related question, because I'm not sure I understand. Can you not do everything that you described in BRMS? You have to go to
If you do it in BRMS, then you're essentially having to write out the Stan code and then use R as a pipeline to hand it over to Stan. So you can do that. You can actually use a lot of the interfaces. I'll close it down, but you don't need to use the Stan. There's basically Stan as a compiler. So it takes the code that you've written and it generates a little program for you to do the sampling for you. That's kind of a little bit difficult to set up sometimes. So you could use, I believe that you can use BRMS, or not necessarily BRMS, but RStan specifically, to write the stan code, and then RStan will compile the program for you. Yeah. But if you use BRMS and most of the, specifically, then it's usually pulling I use them all the time. It's usually pulling an off-the-shelf model. There's going to be a limited number of very common and useful statistical models, but that's often not what you want. So, often in the past, it's always very tempting to take a complicated data set and just try and make some simplifying assumptions, or that you might know might not be true, or trying to reduce the data in some way, manipulate it in some way in order to use another analysis technique. And what I'm saying is that you can do that, but sometimes it's actually beneficial to do a little bit of groundwork to begin with and then generate your own bespoke model. It is a bit of front-loaded with work, but I think it can save you work.
Right, I just want to say a few words about how we could get evidence that something doesn't exist. So most researchers, at least if you engage in hypothesis testing, what that means is you divide the world into two states of affairs. One is in which an effect doesn't exist, there's no slope, there's no difference. And the other is that there is some effect as predicted by the scientific context. So you go off and collect some data, and what you'd like to know at the end of collecting those data is one of three things: that you got evidence that, relative to what could have been there, there's evidence for the claim that something didn't exist, that it wasn't there. Or you could get evidence that it was there, or you just didn't have enough evidence. So there's a three-way distinction that we want to make. But when you read papers in almost any discipline that hypothesis tests, people use p-values. They just do a significance test, and then if p is less than 0.05, they say it does exist, and if p is greater than 0.05, well, there's a bit of ambivalence about what people do. They can get a bit confused, but that's because it only makes, to the extent it makes it a relevant distinction, it only makes a two-way distinction. So non-significance is consistent with either there being evidence for H0, no effect, or with there simply not being much evidence. And it doesn't matter how big the p-value is. It doesn't tell you which one of those two states of affairs within that big box holds. Because you can get a large p-value, I mean one close to 1, because the standard error is very big. The more the noise, the more bigger the standard error, the bigger your p-value. So in that scenario, the bigger the p-value is not more evidence for something not existing. It's just reflecting there's more noise. Or it could be, if you had very little noise, it could be evidence for something not existing. But you don't know. So we can't actually test theories just by the common practice that you see in most papers of significance testing, because we can't find out if the theory is wrong or not, if the theory predicted an effect. Even though people are sort of schizophrenic, as it were, about it. If the main thing they're looking for is significant, then they'll treat any other non-significant result within that paper as completely meaningful, as indicating there wasn't something there. Right. But if the main thing you're looking for is non-significant, they'll say, oh, I don't really know what's going on here. Could go either way. But that's not principal grounds for making the distinction between no evidence and evidence for nothing. So we haven't been in the business, when I say we, I mean almost all disciplines that use hypothesis tests, of subjecting theories to risky tests, which is what I take, following Popper, to be the game of science. Now, one way you can tell this is any package in which you don't say what the size of the thing is that you're looking for, you don't enter that, can't give you an answer about whether you have no evidence or evidence for nothing. Because whether there's evidence for nothing always depends on the size of the thing you're looking for. So there's a certain level of noise. Well, if the size of the thing you're looking for is that big, then you just got no evidence. But if the size of the thing you're looking for is that big, then you have evidence for no effect when you don't spot it through that noise. Or as I sometimes illustrated, I ask the question, is there a non-human animal in this room right now? Well, if I was talking about a rhino, you have excellent evidence with your own eyes that there is no non-human animal in this room right now. You have evidence for H naught. Good evidence. You can get evidence for H naught. Some people might think you can't get evidence for nothing existing, but you can if the size of the thing that you're looking for is huge and the noise of the system is small. But if I say I was talking about an and, well, you don't have evidence one way or the other. I'd have to get down on my knees and crawl around the floor before I could tell you that. So and the question of how big the effect is you're looking for is a scientific question. A statistician can't tell you the answer of how big the thing is you're looking for. Cohen can't say a medium effect size is 0.5, so that's what you're looking for. The noise in the system depends on things like the number of trials, the number of questions in your questionnaire. The size of the effect you're looking for in raw units of what you're looking for depends on what it is you're looking for. If I'm interested in weight change, my measuring instrument for weight has a certain error in it, a certain noise, and there's a certain pre-existing variability in the population about their weights. But if what I'm interested in is a creatine-like substance that might help improve muscle mass with eight weeks of training, then I'm looking at about a 1.5 kilogram possible muscle gain. If it's a laxative for elephants, we're talking about 18 kilos. It all depends on the problem, and as I say, no statistician can tell you what the answer is. So there's something that's much neglected, I think, is the relationship between statistics and the substantive science, which you could call the pragmatics of statistics. You can't just say to the statistician, these are the contrasts I want tested, and the statistician goes off and tests them and says these are the ones which are significant and these are the ones that aren't. That trivializes the problem of the pragmatics of statistics in a way that renders the statistics virtually useless. So now there's various solutions to this. One is power and something like equivalence testing. If you want to go use those solutions, you need to be able to specify a minimum plausible effect of scientific relevance. Where this can come up, I think, is in assumption testing. So skewness, it doesn't matter if I've got 1,000 participants and my data is a bit skewed. Who cares? What matters is if the skewness is if it's less than a certain amount, then the statistics can be robust. So if probably an 80% confidence or credibility interval was contained within what you call a null region, which is a region of skewness which is sufficiently small not to worry about, then you can get evidence that whatever the skewness is, it's not big enough to worry about. And if the credibility interval or confidence interval is outside of that, then you can say, well, no, it is big enough, I do need to worry about it. Clinical studies often minimal effects of clinical relevance can come up. For almost all the problems I deal with, specifying a minimal effect of scientific relevance is incredibly difficult and hard to do in an objective way. So a another approach is to think about what's the rough sort of effect theoretically expected or would be of scientific relevance. And for that, we can use something called a Bayes factor. Because we put in a model of the range of effects that are consistent with whatever the theory is predicting, which could be 0. In the case of creatine, if it produces, past research shows that it's a 1.5 kilogram muscle gain in 8 weeks, and someone says, I think I've manufactured a creatine-like substance, I think it works in the same way, I'd say, okay, if this does produce an effect of muscle gain, it will be between 0 and 3 kilograms, something like that, something around 1.5. But what's important is fixing the rough sort of effect of relevance. And then if that model predicts the data better than a model that there's no effect, then we have evidence for H1. And if the model that says there's no effect predicts the data better, then we have evidence for H0. So, for this you need to start with a scientific claim. So what's the scientific situation we're dealing with? What's scientifically reasonable? That leads to a prediction of a plausible effect, and which we can model. And I call this the model of H1. Bayesians normally call this the prior. But I think that's confusing. Sam was just talking about priors, and he said he uses vague priors. That's because they're what I call estimation priors. You want that sort of prior so you can estimate the data in the most accurate way possible. So that introduces some constraints. It can't be less than this, and it can't be more than that for certain rational reasons. I wouldn't call that subjective, by the way. I'd say those are properties of the problem situation. And those are properties of the problem situation, whether or not any even researcher subjectively knows about it. Because if they didn't know about it, they would have got it wrong. So to me, it's an objective property of the problem situation, following Popper's notion of objective knowledge. So what we want to build into a model of H1 is objective properties of the problem situation. Now, the only way we're testing the theory that we have is if we followed this procedure. Because the scientific claim here is only put to test if we've modelled the claim. If we've used a default Bayes factor, then we haven't tested the claim. A default Bayes factor just puts in a default effect size that you're interested in. But like I'm saying, there is no default effect size for a scientific problem. Okay, it's a laxative for an elephant, that's 18 kilos that they're going to lose if the laxative works. There's a certain noise variability amongst elephants that defines the noise. That's a property of the scientific situation which will vary from situation to situation. Now, if the Bayes factor is about 1, the experiment was not evidential. 10 more minutes. Okay. 5 more minutes. If the Bayes factor, well, the way around it, I normally do it just for ease and convention. If the Bayes factor is greater than 1, then there was evidence for there being an effect. Bayes factor is less than 1, then the data supported no effect. And Jeffrey said when he calculated his Bayes factors on the same problems that Fisher had, when Fisher said p less than 0.05, it corresponds to a Bayes factor of around about 3. And that's about right if you play with it. But there's no monotonic relationship between Bayes factors and p-values. So there's no guaranteed relationship there. But it's roughly right. So that's why most journals conventionally take a Bayes factor of 3 as indicating good enough evidence for there being an effect. But then what we have is, by symmetry going the other way, we can have a Bayes factor less than a third as the equivalent degree of evidence that conventionally we have been taking for 100 years and more. For H1, we have that equivalent amount of evidence for H0. So now we can make the three-way distinction. If the Bayes factor is greater than k, whatever you want to take it to be, evidence for H1, less than 1 over k is evidence for H0. If it's in between, then it's non-evidential. And you shouldn't draw conclusions because you just didn't have enough evidence. So do bear in mind, if your Bayes factor is near 1, there's nothing to explain. other than maybe why the data is so noisy, but you don't explain why there wasn't an effect. You don't know if there was or wasn't an effect. That's the point. But so this puts you in the situation if your theory predicted something and it's non-significant, but your base factor was like 0.5, that does not count against your theory. You've got nothing to explain. You just haven't run enough subjects yet. And this, incidentally, the base factor allows you to have a Bayesian stopping rule, which means you just run until the base factor is sufficiently discriminating. And often we have a stopping rule that's higher than the decision rule, so we might stop when the base factor is more than 5 and less than a fifth, so there's some resilience in our conclusions. You can't do that with p-values in any easy way. Well, you have to plan it all in advance, and once you've done your plan, you can't then collect more data. So with p-values, meta-analyses, hypothesis testing and meta-analyses are forbidden. If you're going to do meta-analyses with hypothesis testing, it has to be Bayesian. Because the Bayesian notion of evidence respects the notion that evidence accumulates, because that's the nature of evidence. So I've written up some papers. This is one if you're interested in looking at, to give you guidance on how to use Bayes factors from the output from any program, as long as you get your parameter value like a mean difference or a slope and a standard error, then in most cases you can just use this program. All right, any questions? Yeah.
Familiar with using your base factor calculator for like p-tests and linear model parameter output. But then what about stuff like correlation coefficients and things like that? What do you do then if you want to report something big?
You can correlations you can convert to Fisher's Z to something which has a normal distribution with known standard error. I tend not to do that though. I'm a great fan of psychologists love they measure something with certain units, they measure something on a certain scale. It might have obvious units like seconds or weight, or it might be Likert units on some scale. Then they get rid of them as fast as they possibly can, as if the scale didn't matter, and deal with standardized effect sizes. I think I personally don't like that, because I think better in terms of the original units. Which is why I use the weight example, because if I either wanted to gain weight by doing weights or lose weight by taking a pill, what I'm interested in is the number of kilos that are lost in a certain time period. I'm not interested in the standardized effect size that depends on the variability between subjects in the control group. It's just irrelevant. And normally I find that thinking about what's actually expected in the scientific context, you can think about that far more clearly when you're doing with raw units. So in the correlation context, the raw units are your regression slope, which means a unit change in this variable, how many units change in the y variable. So I treat it as a problem in estimating a regression slope, which has a certain standard error. And if you have enough subjects, it will be normally distributed. This paper, also my 2019 paper, goes into regression and how to think about it. How do you know what you expect? How do you know what my theory is predicting in the situation? So I give some heuristics to use in my 2019 Advances in Methods in Psychological Sciences paper. Yeah.
So, obviously, if you're dealing with both sides, you don't focus on improvements in how does that wrap into using, say, 3 versus the third or 5 versus the fifth? Because those things seem like sort of the same kind of thing.
Well, in both cases you have a convention. But so you're saying, well, they're similar in the sense of, shall we use a convention or not? So some Bayesians against the whole idea of having... So Jeffreys introduced these conventions in his 1939 textbook when Bayes factors were introduced as a systematic means of inference and introduced those conventions. But in a recent discussion amongst Bayesian, well, I say recent, it was about 5 years ago, a lot of them were saying, we don't like these conventions. You just report the Bayes factor, because the Bayes factor gives you a continuous degree of evidence, and that's what you have, is a continuous degree of evidence. And if you said, well, 3 is what's important, people get hung up whether it's 2.9 or 3.1, and really there's not much difference. Now, I think that's fair enough if you're a methodologist sitting in the armchair, but when you're an actual scientist, you have to make decisions. You have to decide, have I controlled this possible confound well enough, I can move on? Have I got enough evidence against this theory, we can move on to another theory, and so on. We're constantly making decisions about whether something exists or not, so we can get on to the next stage of the research. Now, as a cognitive psychologist, so you could say, okay, Lindsay said what you do is you do a cost-benefit analysis, and that will tell you how much evidence you need depending on the relative costs and benefits of the decision. But when I'm doing cognitive psychology, A, that's rather difficult, and B, I think that just pushes researchers to do self-serving analyses of costs and benefits of certain decisions. It's far better to have a convention to say when something's good enough evidence or not, because that keeps it simple. But you can override the convention. For example, if the theory you're dealing with is incredibly a priori low probability, like parapsychology, you can say we're not going to use a convention of Bayes factor of 3. It needs to be much bigger than that. So you can adjust it. I'd adjust it if you're searching the genome and there's, 20,000 different genes, and you're looking for the gene for something. I would give a priori hypothesis that any given bit of the any given gene was responsible about 1 over 20,000. So you'd need a pretty big Bayes factor before you got off the ground. So sometimes it's good to adjust the convention, but for a lot of standard research, I think it's handy just to have a convention so we can get on and make decisions. The difference with the effect size thing is when people use effect sizes, they lose contact with the meaning of their scales. So psychologists don't care about how well worded or constructed, the precise wording of the scales, the scale points and the questions, because they're going to just turn it into a standardized effect size anyway. But when you're thinking about, well, now what does a difference of 1 really mean? It makes you care about the way you're asking questions and the way you're measuring things. Yes.
Do you think it would be reasonable to design your study specifically, or your measure, in such a way that it makes it easier to bring the price? So say you
yes.
Subjective measure, say well, I'm going to use math because 1 point on passing is like 1 unit of experience instead of a confidence rate. Would you think that's reasonable?
Yeah, or you could use a confidence rating, but if you just did not very confident, more confident, bit more confident, and very confident, then you wouldn't know what 1 unit meant, right? But if the confidence scale was, what's your estimated percentage correct on these questions, then it has a meaning, even though it's still subjective. So I agree. So I think that's another reason why I push for the things the way around I do it. It makes you think about what you're asking so that a unit difference in the scale you're using is actually interpretable. Yes, exactly. All right. So I just thought I'd end by talking about open democracy. So Maxine was talking about what is a journal, and what I think a journal should be is a platform for a community of scholars to share their work and improve it. But that isn't what a journal is now. A journal is a method by which certain companies make a lot of money, and a way of giving prestige to some people. In the same way, I think a university is a place where a community of scholars work together, and they should run it as a community of scholars in order to enable research and teaching and the transmission and the development of knowledge in the optimal way possible. But things haven't been going very well for universities. And I think part of the problem is we simply haven't lived up to that definition I just gave, as simple as it was. Just as journals self-evidently are not what I said they should be, so are universities self-evidently not what I said a university is. I got the name Open Democracy from Helen Landemore. Her most recent book, 2026, it's a really good read. And it's her attempt to communicate her ideas to the general public. So what's open democracy? You probably all know about citizens' assemblies. There's a whole range of bodies like that which are called mini-publics. Citizens' Assembly is just the most well-known of them. So what you do is, to make a decision for a country, an institution, a state, whatever it is, consider it as consisting of a set of citizens that constitute the body of the institution we're talking about. To make a decision, as she calls it, politics without politicians, you randomly select from that body. Everyone has an equal chance of being chosen. Then you form small groups, but you want to know what these people would think if they deliberated and knew and were well informed and had thought through the arguments. So they form discussion groups, they have information packs, and you have moderators making sure that each person has an equal say, that no one dominates the conversation, that everyone talks. And you have moderators to make sure that people consider arguments for their own sake. This goes back, I keep talking about objective knowledge. I know you meant to say everything is subjective in some quarters. But when I'm talking about objective knowledge, I mean we must consider arguments for their own sake. That's it. So talking about characteristics of a person and being rude about them or dismissing arguments because of personal characteristics, the moderator makes sure that doesn't happen. You focus on the arguments and then you make a decision that hopefully is actually realised and implemented. Now she goes through various examples where this has happened. This happened at citizens' assemblies in Ireland in 2012 to 14, where they considered, for example, should there be gay marriage? I can't remember which was first, but 2 years later they had another one. So this decision was too difficult for the politicians to come down on. So they handed it over to a body like I'm talking about, a citizens' assembly or mini public. Or what about the law on abortions? They had another one on that. Or there was a deliberative body of ordinary citizens that got together to construct a constitution for Iceland. And then there was other bodies that considered climate change, how to deal with climate change in France and so on. She goes through a number of these examples. And she was there at a number of these events. And she lists various attributes of what's going on. And I'm going to reframe, so she didn't quite put in this frame, I'm going to reframe it in terms of the values I started with at the very beginning of the day. So one of the things she talks about is it promotes collegiality, people connecting with kindness. So the sense of bonding that came out of this was something that really impressed her, and she wrote a long chapter on. Concerns for the problems of others. When you sit down in front of someone else who's having certain problems, you're forced to face that this sort of person in that sort of context has this sort of problem. You might not have had to face that. You might not have had to look someone in the eyes before and to realise there's this sort of problem that does need to be addressed and you can't just brush it aside. And she discusses how people, even when they were on opposing sides of the argument, that because of this collegiality, that their contributions were always appreciated, generally. And she also argues they made impartially better decisions. That, for example, the constitution in Iceland, generated by the deliberative body of ordinary citizens compared to that created by experts, was superior. Because remember, these ordinary citizens have access to experts when you run this, so they can get the technical knowledge that they need. So the notion that the ordinary citizen couldn't possibly make the hard decisions that the experts make doesn't seem to be borne out. So in other words, the values I started with are promoted by open science, by open democracy. So these are my claims. The way decisions are made at university mismatches the way science itself functions, because science itself is at core a democratic process. It should be the case that anyone can contribute depending only on the quality of their contribution. It's not the case, it is the case, but it shouldn't be the case. It's not why science works. That's because some authority says something, we must obey the authority. That's not what makes science science. What makes science science is anyone, if they make a good argument, that argument should be considered for its own sake and advance the argument. Now, when you look at the history of science, you see that it flourishes in more open democratic societies, and in societies which are closed and authoritarian, science tends not to do so well. So science may only function optimally if the culture in which it is governed becomes aligned with the way the thinking required in science itself. And also it may be the case, independent of this, that the quality of decision-making in an institution may improve if it is based on open democratic deliberation which integrates information across the whole university. Because if science creates some of the most amazing achievements of humankind, you might think that that sort of decision process could be harnessed for other things than just creating knowledge like quantum physics and so on, which I think is some of the most amazing achievements of mankind. But if it's a democratic process that leads to that outcome, then maybe we can harness that for institutional level decisions. So I wrote a paper on this in 23, and I think a start would be consider a problem that a senior management may not wish to put the name to either way the decision could go. It's a bit like in the Irish Assembly. Politicians didn't want to say, let's allow gay marriage, let's forbid gay marriage. Either way, they felt that they're going to be punished. Hand it over to a citizens' assembly, say, I wipe my hands of it, I take no responsibility, we go with the answer, and that's because you decided that. So there can be a number of difficult decisions in a university, one could imagine, where it could be in the VC's interest to hand it over. And although it's very difficult to get people in senior management to admit that a deliberative body of randomly selected citizens could do anything like as well as they do, there might be situations in which they're prepared to admit it would be useful to them. So I also think that information about how the institution is doing is distributed around the whole institution. In every nook and cranny, nobody knows everything about how it's working. And what we want to do is globally integrate that information from all over the place. And the mini-public idea does that global integration, because you're constantly randomly selecting from different nooks and crannies of the university, bringing people together, deliberating, which is integrating information and making decisions. And then if you're constantly doing this, like happened in ancient Athens, then you're constantly sampling information from all around the university and integrating it in decision-making. One consequence of this is that everybody gets to know about how the university is working because we're constantly talking with other people from all sorts of corners of the university. But it's built into the very procedure of the university that is integrating information. It's not a matter of having paper trails or having some declarative database somewhere listing everyone who's doing this and not doing that. It's just procedurally built into how the thing works. And it's what procedurally happens what matters, because procedural knowledge is what gets stuff done. So one can imagine this going all the way, and one having no senior management, that you randomly select people from schools to form various committees, to form an executive committee. This is what ancient Greece did, Athens, and it lasted longer than our current democracy has yet lasted, and outperformed. And of the 1,000 or so classical Greek states, those who adopted democracy outperformed the other states in terms of wealth generation, cultural generation, knowledge generation. So in that context, it was provably better than tyranny and authoritarian rule. So open democracy makes institution transparent to itself procedurally, by the very way it's run. You're just constantly recycling information when you're making decisions. Every citizen potentially makes a difference to the decisions that are being made and becomes informed about how the university works in this system. Now, one thing I'm 100% sure of is it will increase morale and sense of community. And if there's one thing we can also be sure of, one of the big problems of universities the last 20 years or so has been morale and a sense of community. So it would address that. You just have to look at every study that's ever been done. And these citizens' assemblies, deliberative polls, and other mini-publics have been done in 150 countries over many decades. The sense of being part of a bigger system, of doing something valuable, comes across in all of those studies. Now, question mark, would it facilitate impartially better decisions? I think that would be interesting to investigate. Helen Landemore presents evidence that it could, and that it might. And would it foster the sort of deliberative spirit that might enable science to do better? I'm not sure if it would, but just you hear about cases where I think the way it works is in a culture in which deliberation and treating everyone as potential equals, in the sense of you focus on the argument itself rather than on personal matters, creates the conditions where this becomes a norm. And if you're in a society which is somewhat authoritarian, you don't speak back to your boss, and that way you don't deliberate. So one thing you hear about sometimes is big PIs telling their ECRs to p-hack, and the ECR is very unhappy about this, but wouldn't dare speak back to the PI. But maybe in a culture where it was just taken for granted that you deliberate, there'll be less of that happening, and hence more open science. But that's a question mark, I can't say. So those are some thoughts. So what we've said so far about open science and increasing rigour, I think we're on solid ground in terms of saying this would make a difference. What I'm saying now, just to finish off with, is I think it'll make a difference, but we don't know because no one's tried it. Not for universities, but I think it's worth a try. So that was just my suggestion. All right, thanks.
You proposed open democracy to Sasha.
When Sasha first arrived, I said, could we talk about incorporating some open democracy? She said, sure, we'll have a coffee, I'll book it in. I reminded her some months later. She said, I'll read your paper and then I'll arrange a meeting with you. She read my paper and I never heard back from her. But if you read Sasha's response to the community plan, where the community plan suggests basically the sorts of ideas. I was one of the authors of an early version of the community plan, so I planted some seeds for open democracy and not giving money to Elsevier and so on. And other people had built on those ideas in extremely helpful ways about how open democratic practices have been provenly useful in other contexts. Sasha last week wrote, had this long PDF, and she basically said, nah, you couldn't make the difficult decisions that I make. Democracy isn't going to do it. I found that rather condescending.
Is it a problem with the idea that if you want to university leadership is that communities make things more democratic?
Yeah, I mean, there is a problem. How do you get leaders to give up power? But it does happen because these, there are examples of it happening in the political context, not where leaders have completely given up power, but they've tried experiments, particularly to make difficult decisions. So that's where I think you get you sort of get a shoe-in. You say, well, there must be some decision that would be in your interest, not to sign off your name to as the one who is responsible for it. Of course, they have to be ultimately responsible for it, but they could hand over responsibility to a mini-public. I think what could happen, once you try it once, and if it was a success, then you realise it's lifted spirits, for people feeling better, things are going better. You try it again with something else, you try again with something else. And then I think what can happen is an institution can get known as one that is run to some degree in an open democratic way, and then that university stands out from all the others which are just doing things the same. So it can then become a beacon of doing things differently, which could then attract intellectuals, good people, and so on. And so it could build up in that way. So the question is how to get it started, yeah.
Just got to find enough really tricky decisions that the senior management don't want to make themselves, basically.
No, I mean, we could be in a good position now because we've got to cut costs. So they can wipe the hands of a certain decision. They can lay out exactly what the choice is and then say, okay, now you guys decide. Yes. I'm not sure if they continued in the Irish Republic. One place they have continued is Belgium, which has a standing body, which is an open democratic mini-public. And in France, they have a standing body, which is an open democratic mini-public like this. So it is sort of taking footholds in various political contexts.
The point of the they're told that they are to make it. So for them to say, you know these decisions are unmade, a weird kind of response.
Yeah, I mean, read her response for yourself, in case I've been too rude. No, I don't know who was emailed it. I was on an email list that got it, but you didn't get it, did you? I don't know who that was sent to exactly. Yeah, it's in there. That's it. That's it. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not that he's to make different decisions they are. They're to make different decisions.
Yeah.
I guess one reason it works in politics is that if you vote for the politicians, problem to the vote. So if they're a typical decision, they don't want that to influence their voters. So they need to vote, but we don't actually vote for the person who are in management.
No, although they've done this in non-democratic countries like China. So in Zheguo County, they wanted to know how to spend a certain amount of money that the council had. And so they had 30 proposals, and they take a random selection of the citizens there to decide. And the council said, well, we go with whatever you decide. And they were somewhat surprised by the result, because the council thought they'd have a big square that looked grand and looked nice, but the people went for parks where the children can play and improvement in sewage works. And they say, okay, respect their decision, we'll go for it. And that's what they did. And James Fishkin has documented in deliberative polls, this was sort of mini-public, was a deliberative poll, that people's decision-making moves to impartially better solutions. In other words, what's better for everyone, all considered, rather than in my personal vested interest. And that's because you're engaging with real people in front of you, flesh and blood, and you're feeling their problems. And so you become more sort of group motivated. Anything else? All right, so now the Centre for Open Science Research Reform is hereby launched and opened. And look forward to seeing all you guys talking about these issues that have been raised, and hopefully people pursue things that have been talked about, and we get more open science practices happening. Thanks very much.
Got that book ready to go.
It's a really good read, actually.
That was absolutely fabulous. That was really inspirational.